I'm delighted to welcome Carrie Bradshaw. Carrie's an environmental lawyer with particular interest in waste, climate change, especially mitigation and environmental liability, together with the relationship between environmental law, tortious liability, and corporate responsibility. I hope I'm pronouncing all these things right, Carrie.
Well,
Her current research examines food waste as a distinct legal and policy problem. As part of this, she was an ESRC-funded Parliamentary Academic Fellow, seconded to the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, or POST as we know it, and commissioned to write a major report on food waste, which I really recommend having a look at. It's a brilliant report. She's advised several government, business and third sector organisations on food waste law and policy, provided oral and written evidence to Parliament, and personally briefed several parliamentarians. She's also an editor of the Environmental Law Review. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the talk this afternoon. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carrie. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. It's very sunny here in West Yorkshire. I suspect it might be sunny wherever you are. The beauty of giving online lectures, not being able to see your audience, is that I can imagine you all basking in the sunlight, listening to me talk about food waste law and regulation. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, because I'm an academic lawyer. But a recurring theme that I'm going to keep coming back to is the ways in which paying attention to how the burden of responsibility for food waste and where we place those burdens can help us better design food waste law and regulation, while also helping us navigate what sort of food waste legislative journeys are perhaps best avoided. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think are a good idea, as well as some legislative interventions that I think are a bad idea. So why is food waste important enough to get on the legislative timetable at all? I suspect many of you will already know that preventing food waste is a necessary component of the drastic changes required to ensure a sustainable food future. The most famous stat that I hear over and over again is that a third of all food produced globally is not eaten. That has various and extensive environmental implications, including for the climate. Food waste for a country would be the third biggest emitter of climate change gases after the US and China. And preventing food waste, therefore, including meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goal of halving food waste by 2030, is but one necessary element of reducing the environmental impact of the food we eat, and indeed reaching the Paris climate goals. And you can see in there the role of halving food waste in decarbonising food production. The food waste, the UK wastes a lot of food right across the food supply chain. To put that 10.7 million tonnes that you can see there on the slide into context, approximately 1/4 of the 42 million tonnes of food purchased in the UK is wasted. So 25% of food is wasted in the UK. There's all sorts of reasons for this food waste, and they're notoriously complex. But I think the most important thing to remember, particularly when we think about responsibility, is not to conflate the location of food waste with its causes. So you'll see there that households waste 60% of UK food waste, but the reasons for that don't necessarily originate in households. There might be factors elsewhere in the supply chain, or about the way in which we structure our society, that causes that food waste at that specific location. And the same is also true for food wasted upstream in primary production. You'll also see here that retailers waste very little waste in store, but it's important to note that there are concerns in the literature that retailers are responsible for food waste elsewhere in the supply chain, and I'm going to come back to that. For reasons that are probably obvious from that slide, household food waste has tended to be the priority. It's the biggest single source of food waste in the UK, and food wasted here is more environmentally damaging than food wasted upstream because of the resources and energy you accrue as you process, package and transport food. However, for various reasons, we will likely need measures that target food waste reductions at each stage of the food supply chain, particularly in primary production. And I'm going to be talking more about that upstream part of the supply chain today, rather than households. Why do we need legislative measures to prevent food waste? Well, the main reason is that the voluntary measures upon which the UK largely relies are increasingly of limited effect. So the UK's approach, administered by WRAP and centred around the Courtauld Commitment and the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap, these voluntary measures did, up until 2018, coincide with estimated reductions in levels of UK food waste, but WRAP has noted that these reductions could have been due to population changes and rising food prices, and since 2018, we have seen some increases in food waste. And in some ways, this perhaps ought not to be a surprise. RSPB's systematic review that you can see on the slide there concluded that voluntary measures are rarely, if ever, an effective substitute for regulatory measures. And as I detail in this report for Parliament, there's little to no evidence to support some of the more widely deployed or recommended interventions within that voluntary space. So little to no evidence that informational campaigns or public awareness campaigns like Love Food, Hate Waste actually prevent food waste. Ditto for food sharing and various other food waste apps. Smart bins, smart fridges, smart packaging, blockchain, Internet of Things, all these fancy technologies, little evidence that they actually prevent food waste. There are also lots of things which evidence suggests could be effective at reducing food waste that just aren't being done. So, for instance, retailers have dragged their feet in applying best practices on date labelling and selling products loose without packaging that could help households waste less food. And there have also been concerns about some of their contractual practices that drive food waste and overproduction in the supply chain. And I'm going to come back to that question of contractual practices a little bit later. Why haven't voluntary measures been effective? This is complicated, but ultimately it's because the financial or other incentives are lacking. So there isn't a sufficient business case for food waste prevention to underpin ambitious voluntary action across the food supply chain. Ultimately, food or some food is relatively cheap to waste. And because of the structure of the supply chain, there's little financial incentive to help someone else in the supply chain prevent their food waste. And scattered all over that report for Parliament are examples of how achieving food waste reductions in one part of the supply chain requires someone else to spend money, someone else to reduce profits, or someone else to sacrifice competitive advantage. And again, slow progress, particularly from retailers but other actors on unfair trading practices, on date labelling and packaging, are an example of that. The structure of retail supply chains in particular is also relevant here. So you'll see on the slide what looks a bit like an hourglass, and at the apex of that hourglass is a relatively small number of retailers with quite significant economical buying power, and fewer of them than the larger number of suppliers and farmers that they procure from. Now, this imbalance of power means that suppliers, and in particular farmers, are often what's called term and price takers. And this makes them vulnerable to unfair trading and other contractual practices that cause food waste. It's also important to note that this structure of the supply chain also drives down the price of food, which makes food cheaper to waste. The structure of the supply chain also means that savings that a supplier might gain from maybe investing in a food waste prevention intervention, if they can afford to do that, can essentially be squeezed by low prices for food. And my PhD student found evidence of some suppliers hiding successful food waste prevention efforts for fear that a buyer or a retailer will come after them for price reduction as a result of having achieved that saving. And this is exacerbated by supermarket business models that are basically based on volume, not margins. So we have some products like carrots here, as you'll see on the slide, that are essentially sold as a loss leader, with retail profits basically being underwritten by selling alcohol and tobacco at higher margins. So all of this, imbalances in power and downward pressure on food prices undermines the ambition of what we can achieve through voluntary approaches. And increasingly, the evidence suggests that these voluntary approaches are now limited to picking the low-hanging fruit or the easier aspects of food waste prevention. And the government in 2018, which feels like a different world now, all but admitted that the voluntary approach was insufficient. So on the slide there, you can see the 2018 Resources and Waste Strategy, in which DEFRA proposed various legislative measures to prevent food waste. We haven't had anything since 2018 that looks like a food waste policy, but we are expecting a new circular economy strategy from the government this year. And this document here on the slide, probably what we'll have to compare the new government against. But in my published work on this 2018 strategy, I raised concerns that the approach outlined failed to implement a consensus that has emerged in the UK that responsibility for preventing food waste should be shared or distributed amongst lots of actors, and particularly those powerful actors. And I had a concern that it put too much emphasis on charities and farmers bearing the burden of redistributing surplus food, rather than, for instance, powerful actors like government or retailers also playing a role in trying to reduce the fact that we have food surpluses and overproduction. So there's two pieces of legislative intervention that were proposed in that strategy that I want to talk to you about. And they're also a way in which we can think about how this concept of shared responsibility might apply in the context of law and regulation. And the first is mandatory food waste measurement and reporting for certain food businesses in the supply chain. And this will be really important because there's a phrase, and it's true, you cannot manage what you don't measure. And there's big data gaps in food waste and how much we waste in the UK. But since 2018, there's been a lot of back and forth on mandatory reporting, and fast forward to 2025, and it still hasn't been implemented. Now, this kind of toing and froing and delay probably undermines the already limited voluntary approach to food waste, because a meaningful kind of legislative threat operating in the background is often a really important success factor in a voluntary approach. There's also concerns that the initial proposal, which was to exclude from the reporting obligation food wasted on farms, that if implemented, this could actually lead to greater levels of food waste on farms, because there it would be hidden from view. So if there was a risk that food wasn't going to be eaten, or it was a risk that food was going to be wasted, then either you leave it on the farm or you try and push it back to the farm level. There's also a risk that that type of approach could exacerbate unfair trading practices, particularly those of retailers, that cause food waste in the supply chain. And I'm coming to that next. But before I do, I and others have suggested that a better way to highlight and share responsibility for food waste across the food supply chain would be to have a kind of supply chain reporting obligation for retailers. So they'd be required to report not only the food they waste, but also the food that's wasted in their supply chain. But ultimately, as long as food is relatively cheap to waste, and voluntary approaches are of limited effect, it doesn't follow that what gets measured gets managed. So mandatory reporting really is a necessary but not sufficient measure to prevent food waste. The other area of legislative intervention that I wanted to flag, and which was a really important part of the 2018 food waste policy, relates to these unfair trading practices that I've kept mentioning but haven't explained. So there's two great reports there that talk about this in a bit more detail, but examples of some of these practices include applying penalties to farmers or suppliers if they can't deliver a specific amount of certain produce at a particular spec, so carrots that are right length or cabbages that are right colour. If they're not delivered on time and in full, then penalties may be applied. In the background is a threat of being removed or delisted as a supplier if you miss a delivery or by a small margin. There's also some evidence that retailers and other buyers tighten cosmetic or aesthetic requirements around food in order to reject produce when demand is low, but maybe loosen those standards when demand is high. And these and other practices that have been documented in the literature can lead suppliers to overproduce and waste food, but that overproduction becomes a sort of insurance policy. Now, I don't know how good the estimates are of overproduction rates, but I've seen estimates of overproduction between 10 and 40% on farms. And when you think about how much surplus food that is, it's concerning that there's also been incidents of retailers prohibiting suppliers from selling surplus elsewhere. But that systematic review that you'll see on the left basically concludes we do need a bit more research on this topic. But what do we have in place to address these types of practices? Essentially, we have two separate regulatory regimes for trying to deal with unfairness in food supply chains. And on the left there, we have one major regime that covers grocery retailers, the largest grocery retailers, and their direct suppliers, who are usually, but not always, food manufacturers. And this just basically requires those retailers to deal fairly with their direct suppliers. Now, it's really important to note this wasn't implemented to deal with food waste, but there's lots of optimism in the food waste literature about how this could be used to prevent food waste in the supply chain. And I don't share that optimism about this intervention. This is because GSCOP, the Grocery Supply Code of Practice, is a creature of competition law, and its legal enforcement was recommended by the Competition Commission because buyer power was seen as a problem for consumers and ultimately undermining competition between retailers and hampering the goal of competition to basically drive down the price of food. And that is partly why we have food waste in the first place. So competition between retailers drives down the price of food and leads to a variety of wasteful practices at store level. So it's not an obvious home for food waste prevention. We have very little evidence exploring the impact of GSCOP on food waste. The one study that I've seen found that it had been good at improving relationships between retailers and their suppliers, but that it had been less effective against those practices that cause food waste. We also now have the beginnings of a new regime that applies to manufacturers and processors and requires them to deal fairly with farmers and producers. Now, this is ostensibly not about enhancing competition to lower prices, and it was also part of that 2018 food waste policy that I mentioned before. It's not really implemented yet. It's only partially implemented in its very early days. So whether this will make a difference to food waste remains to be seen. But it doesn't apply to retailers. And many of the problems that were identified by farmers in the consultations that related to practices that cause food waste were actually practices that originated higher up the supply chain. So retailers were applying pressure to manufacturers, and that was being fed down to farmers. So the regime on the right is kind of treating the symptoms of problems higher up the supply chain. Concerns have also been raised that we're getting lots of intermediary organisations basically being created to evade both regimes. We're waiting really for better evidence on that, but that could in turn affect the ability of fairness regulation to tackle the food waste problem. And obviously seeking to evade regulation is not shared responsibility, it's the opposite of that. And this fragmented regime is allowing that abrogation of responsibility. Now, are there any legislative interventions that are not needed? And I think the answer to this is obviously yes. Not all legislative ideas are a good idea, but I would hazard against legal measures to support the further institutionalization of surplus food redistribution. My assessment is that warnings that were made over 20 years ago still ring true, that redistributing surpluses of food to feed food insecure people is a distraction from addressing the root causes of overproduction, food waste, and inequality. Now, obviously, if we have more food than we need, it should be eaten by people, ideally by those who need it most. But if we continue as is, we're heading towards what a colleague here at Leeds, Effie Papageorgiou, calls a lose-lose future of food insecurity and high levels of surplus and waste. So as a result, I disagree with some prestigious institutions, including the Harvard Food Law Clinic's Global Food Donation Policy Atlas, which has proposed that the UK should adopt legislation based either on the French Garot law or that the UK should implement Good Samaritan laws. I'm going to focus on the latter, but I'm happy to talk about the Garot law if people have questions as well. So what are Good Samaritan food donation laws? These are a response to claims that a significant barrier to redistributing surplus food and preventing food waste is a fear of liability should recipients become ill after consuming donated or redistributed food. And broadly speaking, these laws provide some sort of protection from criminal and/or civil liability for donating food. And several countries have, in the last 10 years, introduced such laws. So in Singapore in 2024, Argentina and Israel in 2018, Peru in 2016, Italy has a Good Samaritan food donation law, and in 2023, the United States extended the federal liability protections that they've had in place there since 1996. So this is very much an area of legislative activity. And I'm concerned that really these are a solution in need of a problem. I'm undertaking a scoping review of the evidence here, but the tentative conclusion that I want to offer today is that claims about liability fears are neither well-grounded empirically nor well-articulated in the literature. My starting point in exploring the evidence was just to look at existing systematic and other evidence reviews on the causes of food waste and barriers to surplus donation. And the first two that I looked at offered little to no evidence to support their finding that a fear of liability is widespread or well-founded. So the literature was making this finding and then citing in support articles that made no reference whatsoever to a fear of liability or just relied on mere anecdote. There are some better systematic reviews in this regard, and there is some primary academic research which provides a bit of evidence for liability fears amongst relevant actors. But so far, I haven't found many such studies, and there's still a lot that we don't know about the true nature, prevalence, degree, and source of reported liability concerns. So, for example, the existing research provides only a limited insight into whether the fears are about liability rather than, say, reputation, whether they're widely held or not, and by whom. Is it retailers, restaurants, redistribution charities? Are they more determinative than economic or logistical barriers? And this is the really important thing. It's really unclear or sometimes unknown from the studies what the source of the legal fear is. Is it civil or tortious liability? Is it criminal liability? Is it something else? And this is really important because some of the studies calling for Good Samaritan laws and citing fear of liability concerns relate to legal obligations that Good Samaritan laws do not address. Now, of course, a lack of evidence doesn't mean there isn't a fear of liability. There may be, and as I'm going to argue later, it's not necessarily a bad thing that people are worried about liability. But we need to better understand, I think, the nature of these fears before adopting what are potentially quite drastic measures that change the law, that disapply the general principles of civil criminal law simply because food is being donated. And in that regard, I think another problem with the evidence here is that it doesn't distinguish between what I think are two separate liability problems with potentially different solutions. So the first problem is basically one where people say liability is too strict or too stringent or too expansive. But what this really means, impliedly, if not explicitly, is that people think liability is too strict relative to the aim of preventing food waste and feeding food to people. And so far, most, not all, but most of the studies that I've identified that make this claim just don't acknowledge that the law can serve a broader social purpose here, aimed at ensuring food safety or compensating people for harm. So I'm worried that there's a balance or a value judgment that's just being glossed over in the literature and in some of the legislation. The second problem is basically a knowledge problem. It's people say, I don't know or understand what the law says. And there's some good evidence for this, I think. But at the same time, that lack of knowledge is often just given as kind of background context, or it's just assumed that people don't understand the law is, without specifying what is the particular area of law that people don't understand and we need to address. And these claims require some interrogation, because there's some studies which demonstrate that relevant actors are confused, but the study authors will say, well, we found this surprising or unexpected because the legal situation is actually quite clear in that jurisdiction. And here's a really important thing that's coming out from the evidence review, is that legal misperceptions or confusions can persist even in the presence of a Good Samaritan law. So there was one US study that identified widespread liability fears amongst respondent restaurants, but described these fears as unfounded, given liability protections have been in place there since 1996. For me, as a lawyer, there's sort of two related legal questions here. And I'm going to gloss over these a little bit because I think they're perhaps of less interest to a legal audience, a non-legal audience. But the first question, is the law actually too strict? Do we need to change it? Obviously, that depends on the jurisdiction. But using England as example, the answer to this question really is no. We already have existing protections in criminal law, in the tort of negligence, under strict liability, which means that I think these sort of Good Samaritan laws are unnecessary in England. And I'm just not convinced that a similar analysis has been undertaken in those jurisdictions which have recently passed these laws. Now, they may not be perfect laws. These protections that the UK has might not be perfect, but all of the claims that the law in England is too strict, which I have identified as part of this research, fail to acknowledge these existing protections. So the only publicly available legal guide to food donation in the UK fails to even mention these protections, while at the same time calling for a Good Samaritan law. And these claims around the law being too strict are simply not credible. The second question, is the law uncertain or confusing? I think probably yes. I think most law is confusing to people who aren't lawyers. That confusion is probably not helped by the fact that the only legal guide to food donation law in the UK contains lots of errors and omissions. And I think there probably is some confusion or disagreement about how some of these laws apply in particular areas, but they're quite esoteric, sort of narrow points of law that leading lawyers argue about, but it's not what I think probably keeps redistribution charities up at night. And even if the law is confusing, jumping to change it is potentially heavy-handed for various reasons, and as we know from the US experience, might not make any difference anyway. Which brings me to reasons why I think Good Samaritan laws might be undesirable. And there's lots of reasons for this. The law in this area has a protective purpose, and restricting liability could have negative side effects for food safety and compensation. It's also really important to note what Good Samaritan laws do. If we hold someone liable for negligence, what we're saying is they haven't taken steps considered reasonable in the context of a charity donating food, and we're holding them, or more likely their insurers, liable for any harm which that has caused. Now, under the Good Samaritan law in the US, there'd be no liability here, and simply because the food is being donated to people in need. And I'm not sure that's a good enough justification. As I've already alluded to, there's also a large body of expert opinion that basically argues that donating, redistributing surplus food on a large scale should be a time-limited intervention. And Good Samaritan laws are kind of the opposite of that. They're an institutionalization of what should be a time-limited intervention. And even if we are minded to provide some protection, I think there's a case for restricting protection to charitable redistribution organisations. Retailers and supermarkets donating large quantities of food, often at last minute, sometimes of questionable quality, which they've deliberately overordered and priced in as part of a business model. These are not Good Samaritans worthy of legal protection. And a report published by Feedback yesterday demonstrates this. There's lots of evidence that businesses in some instances are dumping surplus food onto charities, and in doing so, avoiding responsibility for their waste. There's also no guarantee that Good Samaritan laws actually prevent food waste. They might increase food donation, but this food might still be wasted, especially if the food that's being donated at the retail level is not of good quality. For these and other reasons, I'm really concerned about the recently expanded scope of the US law, which in 2023 means that liability protections apply not just for donated food, but food that's been sold for a Good Samaritan reduced price, so a price that reflects the costs of redistributing it. And I have some big concerns about that extension there. So I think legal guidance is probably a better solution here than potentially quite drastic law changes. But ultimately, we need to know a lot more about these fear of liability concerns before deciding what, if anything, to do about them. And that's my thoughts for you today on food waste law and regulation, and in particular, the importance of building and sharing responsibility into legal frameworks across the food supply chain. So if we think about who we're placing responsibility on, it can help us design mutually supportive legal obligations around mandatory reporting and fairness in the supply chain, and thinking about the burden of responsibility for food waste and food surplus can also help us navigate some of the sort of food waste legislative journeys that I think perhaps might have been best avoided. So thank you very much indeed for listening, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, Carrie. That was a really good outline of where we are, where we might be, where other people are, and what we can learn from them. And I think there's some really good questions coming up in our Q&A section. So just to remind people, if you have questions for Carrie, please put them in the Q&A section, and we'll go through some of them now. I'll try to group them together if I can. So you mentioned laws in France and other places. The first question that we had was from Alicia Hyams, who's asking about regulation in France put fairly on supermarkets to stop them from throwing away food. And do you think this would be something that the UK would be willing to adopt?
Yeah, it's a great question. I knew if I flagged the Garrett law, people would want to talk about it. So it was one of the things that was mooted. Is it Alicia?
Yeah.
Alicia. It was one of the things mooted in the 2018 Resources and Waste Strategy, alongside the mandatory food waste reporting and dealing with unfairness in the food supply chain. And I argued in my article in 2020 that I thought this was a really bad idea. But that idea of who are we putting the burden on for preventing food waste? I think this idea that charities will be responsible for dealing with the surpluses of business models that are premised on surplus and overproduction is placing a legal burden in the wrong place. And there's also some evidence coming out of France now that actually it hasn't really solved the problem. There's some evidence to suggest that it might have increased the quality of food that's donated, but there's concerns that it's leading to supermarkets treating charities as a dumping ground for food that they can't sell, and it may have even exacerbated problems of overproduction further up the supply chain. So if you're interested in the Garrow law in the post brief, which isn't brief, by the way, it's a misleading name. It's long. But if you have a look in the post brief, particularly in the chapter on retailers and in the chapter on governance, the evidence that I could find relating to the Garrow law is there. And I think it would be a mistake for the UK to adopt such a measure. And I hope they don't.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, I think yeah, a lot of those things that you just mentioned sort of feed into a few of the other questions that we've got, and cycle back to some of those. What can we do? What should we do? What might work? And really great to sort of have that, yeah, the evidence base that you're talking about is interesting. And one of the questions that came up, that was a question that I had as well, that was around Shalene Milu as asking, do you have examples of successful incentives to encourage businesses to reduce food waste? So I think you said that we know that there are some things that aren't effective, but we know that there are things that are effective that aren't being introduced, and why that might be. So yes, do you have any examples of things that we could be doing?
Yeah, I mean, so from a legal perspective, obviously, when you're doing something new for the first time, you don't have direct evidence, but you're trying to kind of triangulate from other contexts. So the reporting is an obvious one. We have some big data gaps. You really can't manage what you don't measure, and the unfair trading practices, which I talked about. There's something else that if you're thinking about legislation. And obviously there's hundreds of potential things that you could do to deal with food waste, but I'm a lawyer, so I'm interested in legislation. Something that has been tried in other jurisdiction is variable food waste charging, or sometimes called pay as you throw schemes. So in England, we pay a flat rate for our waste, including our food waste, no matter what quantity of it we waste, because we pay council tax and that covers our waste collection costs. And in other countries, sometimes you are charged for the amount you waste, basically proportionally based on how much you waste. So if you waste less, you pay less. If you waste more, you pay more. And in South Korea, they have a pay-as-you-throw scheme specifically for food waste, and it's enabled by technology. So the more food waste that you waste, the more your waste tax is. Now there's some evidence that can work, but in the short term, the evidence that works in the long term isn't clearer. And RAP, I understand, have done some kind of practical thinking about if we wanted to do that in the UK and we wanted to reduce things quickly, would that be something they would follow? And I think they'd come to the conclusion that it would be so difficult to set up quickly. But those types of schemes are actually unlawful in the UK. So even if a local authority wanted to trial it, they wouldn't be allowed to. So sometimes you have law here kind of creating a barrier. Questions about whether we should pay more for our food or pay more for our waste are really difficult. And the problem with a kind of waste tax is we might be disproportionately burdening consumers at the end of the supply chain. And there's all sorts of reasons why, just because households throw away food, it doesn't mean that they're singularly responsible for it. And I just remembered that maybe some of our audiences are students, in which case you don't pay for your waste at all because you don't pay council tax. So maybe that was all a bit of a future scenario for you. If there are other things that you're interested in as potential solutions, the post brief isn't a bad place to go and start looking at options.
Thank you. Yeah, and maybe we'll get onto this later, but I think that's sort of why the things that are effective are not being taken up is a really interesting issue, and probably, yeah, a kind of also interesting from a policy perspective. Why aren't they taking up these options? Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of, given that we know that you've put that in your in your policy report, which is actually in Parliament, so are they taking up any of these recommendations, or why might they not be?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the mandatory reporting one. I was in a call in 2019 where I was basically told this is going to happen, and it still hasn't. And I think a revolving door of environment secretaries hasn't helped there. And that would be the same for using the unfair trading practices powers on the right-hand side of the diagram. Before the current government, I think we had 6 environment secretaries in as many years, and they all had quite different sort of ideological starting points about regulation. So I think that's part of it. From a legislation perspective, the timetable is always quite squeezed. I think in the UK, we're very lucky in many respects to have WRAP as an organisation that has enormous expertise and perhaps not enough resources to try and do things without legislation. But they've had no choice, because WRAP's a delivery body that has to deliver the policy choice of a largely voluntary approach. And I think there's probably been a bit too much of optimism and potential reflexive preferences for voluntary rather than regulatory approaches, which is why for 20 years we've had, a focus on what can we get businesses to do by asking them rather than telling them.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's interesting, you talked a lot about the sort of retailer and retailer responsibility and sort of lack of pressure on those bigger, more powerful institutions, perhaps. My colleague Christian Reynolds has posted a few questions, but one of them is about the new Tesco trial. So kind of, I guess, solutions that the retailers might be trying to come up with themselves, and just wondering what you think about that. So this free yellow sticker food after 9:30 in their smaller stores, and how do you think this fits into donation and food waste reduction infrastructure?
So I think my starting point, hi Christian, by the way, thanks for coming. I think my starting point with these retailer initiatives is, on the one hand, to be grateful that it's a priority, but on the other hand, to acknowledge that they're fundamentally profit orientated organizations that ultimately will only be interested in food waste to the extent that their consumers care about it and it affects their bottom line. I think getting them to sacrifice profits or to be slightly less profitable in order to prevent food waste will be limited. So the fact that now they've got so much food that they can't shift, they're giving it away in store rather than redistributing it via charitable channels, is sort of a bit of a sticking plaster, and also treating the symptom of a problem rather than its causes. And I'd be really nervous about liability protections for food that they're just giving away. I think they have a duty of care to their customers, and I want that food to be of good quality, and there's evidence that it not always is. So I welcome, in particular, Tesco's work in this space, but I'm always skeptical about whether these voluntary initiatives are strategically quite helpful in staving off more robust and potentially more ambitious legislative or regulatory interventions. And certainly I'm a little bit nervous that if we get mandatory food waste reporting through the legislative pipeline, that strategically that's quite helpful in staving off more exacting regulation for powerful companies. So those are I don't know if Christian has different thoughts, but I'm skeptical.
Yeah, unintended consequences. Very
That too,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, and there's a few questions about retailers here and what you were talking about retailers and dumping, which we'll go on to in a minute. But I'll try and group some of these together. So Walker Topman, I think was asking, is there a business case or lack thereof for retailers, which I think we've answered that. But also asking, if there is this lack of a business case, what sort of resistance from retailers might we expect if the government wants to implement policy that holds them responsible, thinking of sort of corporate capture and lobbying, and are there any means to overcome these forms of retailers' resistance? And there's lots of thank yous for a great lecture, so
that's
toss that in.
So 2 questions: what would retailers do what would businesses do in response? So a good example of what might be a response to the threat of more exacting legislation is what happened with attempts to extend GSCOP and the grocery code adjudicator down the supply chain. And at one point, retailers just basically threatened to stop funding the grocery code adjudicator if all of a sudden those obligations were going to reach right down the supply chain. So I think the reality is that you do get some organised pushback to legislation that would affect the bottom line. I think the second question was sort of what do we do about lobbying? I don't know.
That's the biggie, right?
Yeah, I mean that is, I mean, it's a really important question. I think in this country with our political funding rules, we are in a better place than we are in the US, where corporate funding, corporate donations for politics is basically free speech and you can't restrict it. But I've written about this in my 2020 piece that I talked about. There are vested economic interests, partly propped up by how we sort of don't really properly regulate supermarkets, but there are lots of vested interests in the status quo of a fundamentally broken food system. And that is, you know, a multi-billion-dollar question, I think. But it's the right, I don't know who the question was from, but it's definitely the right question to be asking. I'm sorry that I don't have the answer.
We'll just keep asking that question. Hopefully we'll get answers to it. Keep on plugging away. So not one but two questions on whole crop purchasing. One from Lisa Jack and one again from Christian. So great to see those questions. Could whole crop purchasing, says Lisa, by retailers manufacturing be encouraged via legal means? It does seem to be effective in reducing some upstream food waste. And
so
slightly different question, just about the same area. Could this be a kind of alternative mechanism that pushes the responsibility to the supermarkets for food loss?
Yeah. So if that's Lisa Jack behind, where is the slide? I don't know if they're still moving. If it's the Lisa Jack behind this slide, really nice to have you on the call. There we go. Really nice to have you on the call. Yeah, whole crop purchasing. So there's a bit of a section on this in chapter 2 of the post brief. And I think that it's a really interesting legal or contractual approach to better sharing responsibility for overproduction and economic risk. I think it's a really good idea. And you're right, there is some evidence that it can be effective, both from a farmer sustainability perspective and in preventing food waste. And there are UK retailers who successfully trialed it. I would really like to see thought about contractual mechanisms like whole crop purchasing being thought about within the context of regulations around unfairness in the supply chain. So those regulations to deal with unfairness in the food supply chain are basically kind of rewriting contracts. They're an intervention to make contracts fairer. And when the government was consulting on its new regulations at the bottom part of the supply chain, there was very little evidence in the consultations that they were thinking about the types of contractual approaches that could prevent food waste, including whole crop purchasing. So I've really been nudging away at that. I don't know if anyone's listening in government, but there's a real opportunity to use that contractual approach to reduce food waste. And I really agree with Lisa Jack about the opportunities, the multiple opportunities that has for risk spreading and waste prevention.
So sticking with retailers, because we have a few questions on those before we sort of move on to something else. Just that you mentioned that retailers have dragged their feet. This is from Anonymous, with date labelling and selling loose produce. In absence of policy, is there anything that might make businesses look at these seriously? And then there's a second question on sort of retailers flooding food banks, which you also mentioned, and whether they're sort of misusing redistribution as a way of minimizing in-store waste. And is it really the case that, we for sometimes sort of paint the retailers the bad boys? Is it really the case that they're always the bad boys, and are they deliberately trying to make the problem worse, or is that a misconception by us? Should we be challenging our assumptions here?
Yeah, if I can take the second question first, actually, and I did want to reiterate this, retailers are just responding to the market and the legal obligations that they have. So they have, I mean, some of them are owned by private equity firms, but if they're a public limited corporation, they have a duty to maximum, well, not maximize profit. They have a duty to seek the success of the company as a whole, ultimately by reference to its shareholders. So they're not legally required, legally able actually to just sacrifice profits and do good. They have legal obligations around that. And similarly, we have a competition law system, and I should hazard here, I'm not a competition lawyer, but we do have a competition system that has sought for the perceived good of the consumer to make the retail sector really competitive. Ultimately, because we have for many years interpreted cheap food as a public good. So I don't think the people who work in retailers are callous or evil or don't care about food waste. I think a lot of them do, but they respond to the legal and market reality, and that is something that government to some extent has created. So yes, I probably should rephrase how I talk about retailers. I should talk about retail practices structured by law, regulation, and markets. So yeah, and if they're flooding the food with flooding the charitable sector with surplus food, we need to think about what are the competitive drivers that means that they think that is a financially sensible thing to do. So I think, yeah, the question was right to pick me up on that. In terms of dragging their feet on packaging and best before dates and things like that, again, there's a little bit of evidence that the reason why they haven't implemented WRAP's best practice guidance is primarily because of competition. It's such a competitive marketplace that being encouraged to do it isn't enough. So I think there is some scope to be tougher on legislation and date labels, but the unintended consequences are really significant there. And I know Christian has done quite a lot of work on, would, for example, removing best before dates necessarily achieve what we wanted to. It's very, very complicated. But retailers and other businesses can only respond to the legal and financial incentives that they're given ultimately.
Thank you. There's a few questions now, either about or from sort of charities, and I think it's really interesting that sort of charitable food waste nexus that you talked about, and is obviously problematic, but some really interesting questions that have come up. So just a really practical one. Somebody has anonymous has just asked from a community fridge, and is asking, is there anything that you think they should know? Just in sort of practical terms, I guess, talking about the liability question that you were asking.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to answer that one
Yeah,
first.
I mean, do anything. I can't give legal advice, particularly not on a public call. But what I would say is that liability really ought not to be your primary concern. There is lots of really good guidance from the Food Standard Agency and from WRAP about how to redistribute food safely. And if you follow that guidance and you have a system that shows that you're careful, then the chances of being held financially or legally responsible for harm as a result of that are infinitesimal. for various reasons. And if you're interested in the reasons why, there's a little public briefing on my SSRN page that looks at some of the existing protections, particularly for charities who the law tends to treat a bit more favourably anyway. And the one thing that I forgot to say, I always forget to say this when I talk about Good Samaritan laws, I've yet to come across an example of someone being harmed by donated food and suing for it. Now, it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, because maybe they're settled out of court, but I have yet to find a case, which is why one of the reasons why I think these Good Samaritan laws are a solution in need of a problem.
Okay,
I hope that
you.
answers the question from the community fridge person, who I suspect is doing really good and important work.
Yeah, and thank you for the reassuring answer. So just a couple more questions on charities. So Mary Adepoju has asked, so thank you for the very insightful lecture. And what about sensitizing charity organizations to reject food donations of low quality? And there's also another question relatedly asking about the sort of mandatory reporting question. Would this produce a greater burden for charities as retailers would be incentivized to move their surpluses to charities who either wouldn't be required to report waste in the same way? And do you think the charities should be included in the mandatory reporting of food waste?
Yeah. Okay. Mary, that's a brilliant question. I think sensitized, empowered. I wonder, Mary, I don't know what your background is, but I suspect the challenge there is twofold. I suspect there's a logistical barrier to getting the food back. I suppose it depends on the model, but there's also, I mean, something that comes out in the literature on this is there is sort of a bit of a power imbalance between retailers and charities. And I wonder if there are concerns that, you know, if you're a charity that all of a sudden starts rejecting large quantities of surplus because you think it's no good, whether there's a risk that compromises the relationship, which I think just goes to highlight the difficulties of the model, that there are competing goals here ultimately, and it's often the profit motive for retailers. You know, the reason why they delay donating stuff to the last possible minute is because they want to sell as much stuff as they can and then avoid the costs of waste when they can't. So I definitely think charities should be empowered to do that. I don't know enough about the individual relationships as to the extent to which that is conducive to a long-term relationship with the retailer. But you might argue, actually, we don't want a long-term relationship with retailers. What we want retailers to do is you know, waste less stuff. But it's a really interesting question, Mary, and I've written it down. I'll keep thinking about that. I think sensitizing and empowerment probably is a combination of the two. And yeah, the question about charities and mandatory reporting. I don't know if charities should be subjected to that. I suspect because they want to know how much surplus they redistribute, because it's part of how, I presume, they evaluate their effectiveness and their work, they're probably already measuring the surplus as they redistribute or valuing it. So it might not be an added burden. I don't know. But something that I think would be really important, and I and others have pushed for this in the mandatory reporting obligation, is to require retailers to report surpluses that they redistribute. Because there's a new report out by Feedback, I think it was out yesterday or the day before, and one of the things that they're very concerned about is when, at least in public reporting, when retailers donate surplus food to a charity, it isn't reported as waste. So it isn't captured in the metrics, even though ultimately to a retailer, once you're donating that food, it's economic waste. It is waste. They're writing it off. It's something they no longer want. They've discarded it. So I think it's probably important to be measuring surpluses. I'm nervous about more burdens on charities in the same way that I'm nervous about more burdens on farmers. But we do need to know, if we're going to keep relying on surplus redistribution, how much donated food actually gets wasted. And one of the things that was highlighted in the post brief is that we actually don't really know that. We don't know if surplus redistribution necessarily always sometimes prevents waste. So yeah, these are really good questions. I hope you can tell that they are challenging me and that they're useful to engage with.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, another question sort of in that charity area, which I think is
Yeah,
interesting because we're sort of sometimes when we think about sort of policy solutions or legal solutions, we sometimes think of this sort of black and white, if only we did this, and
yeah.
things would be different. But and another anonymous question, but or comment regarding this sort of transition a model maybe towards something different, and is there a role for redistribution? So they're asking, what's your take, relating it back to this lose-lose scenario that you talked about, that Effie had talked about.
Yeah.
What's your take on having models that still address the surplus issue by redistribution, which attaches the costs to the generators of the waste, but then at the same time working on food loss and waste generation reduction? So I guess we have to have those two things working in tandem, right? We can't just switch one to the other.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the kind of irony, right? So when I was writing this report, I kept coming across reports from 20 years ago, including from Tim Lang at City and from Sustain, saying 20 years ago, this is not a future that we want to inhabit. This needs to be a bridging not technology, a bridging solution. And yeah, I mean, look, it's difficult because these charities do really important work, and it's not just around food waste prevention that they do work. They provide community. There's some evidence that that they can help reduce loneliness. So food hubs and things like that can serve a really valuable role, and they should continue to do that as long as it's, as long as it's not harmful to people. There's obviously a stigma and a harm associated with having to rely on donated food, and it would be much better to have a more equal society where people don't have to rely on that. But they do a lot of really good work, and I suspect there are ways, perhaps through the legal incentives, perhaps through mandatory reporting, perhaps through ways to facilitate a cost on retailers, to make this a more sensible solution, either in the short term or potentially in the long term. And I think ultimately it comes down to incentives at the retail level. So yeah, I don't know. I'm going to stop there because I am thinking out loud, but it's a really important question. And as with a lot of these things, there's no easy or right solutions, and it's not necessarily that law is always the way to go about achieving them.
Yeah, it's complex as ever. It's a wicked problem, right?
Quite.
Wicked problem. So yeah, requires a lot of thought and time for us to sort it out. Yeah, and thank you so much for kind of dealing with these, a barrage of questions. It's great to have so many questions that we're getting through. So just moving on to the other powerful actor that perhaps doesn't always do as much as it could do, the government. We've had a few questions about that. So a question again from Christian is around very topical, around the new food strategy and what should the government be thinking about food loss and waste when they design their growth focused food strategy. So one of the pillars is obviously of that food strategy is economic growth. There's another question that is asking about whether the government's doing enough, and Georgina Edwards is asking, where should responsibility for legislation, regulation, implementation lie in government? She says DBT or DEFRA or both. So that speaks to some of the work that we've done looking at, where is policy made, and food policy made so much across so many different different departments. And then the question that I just glossed over from another anonymous attendee: do you think food waste is a bigger priority for government as it should be? I think I might guess the answer to that.
Okay, I think I've got all 4 questions. Okay, what should the government be thinking about in the context of the food strategy? I don't have the magic solution to how you build a sustainable food future whilst ensuring economic growth. Are they compatible or not? Perennial debate. What I would be really, and this sort of links in, I guess, to Georgina's question. I think what will be really important will be joined up approaches here, or what, I mean, Christina Vogel talked about and you at City talk about in terms of sort of policy coherence, is yes, we have a food strategy, but we also have a circular economy task force that is hoping to have a new waste strategy in 2025. That's this year. That's how quickly time goes. I'd like to see the connections there. And sometimes when people are working in silos or in very specific kind of narrow areas of expertise, as inevitably you have to when you're an expert, it's really important to keep plugging away at the crossovers. So something that I've spent a lot of time in the last year doing is with the design of the fairness regulations, saying, what about food waste? What about food waste? What about food waste? Because it's not necessarily on their radar. And I think sometimes there's a role there, both for people who work in government departments to be open and listening, and I get the sense that that is the case now, but a role for people on the outside to help draw these connections, because it's a perennial problem of trying to integrate complex solutions to siloed departments. So where I mean, Georgina asked, where should responsibility lie in government, DBT or DEFRA? I don't know where you work, Georgina. Maybe you work in government and have an answer to that. I mean, one of the problems that I think we really have with the regulation of fairness in the supply chain, and you might have twigged it, is the 2 government departments in play here. So we have DBT owning one and DEFRA owning the other. And that creates risks, and you need mechanisms to address that. I'm not going to answer that question directly, Georgina, because I suspect food is in food waste and food across multiple government departments, and the trick is not where, it's how we join it up. Is government doing enough, and should food waste be a bigger priority? I think with this government, it's still, in the UK, it's still a little bit wait and see what comes out of the food strategy, wait and see what comes out of the circular economy strategy. I would have liked the mandatory food waste reporting. I don't think I'm alone in this, and I don't think it would be controversial for me to say that, for them just to have got on with it, given the EU has done it, we've had a consultation on it, there is lots of support to do it. It's difficult to design and implement responses without measuring the problem. So I don't know if food waste generally that's a political decision about relative priorities, but I feel like the mandatory food waste reporting was, really quite long overdue. And I would have liked government to have acted on that quicker, given so much work had already been done up until then. That was 4 questions. Did I hit them all?
You did. That's amazing. It's
okay.
amazing. And we're at 14 minutes past. I'm going to try and squeeze one last one in. We still have quite a few. I'm very sorry to anybody I couldn't get your question in, but I think one related one, which I think was just related to what you were just talking about and ends us on a policy note. Just that you mentioned that South Korea had adopted this pay-as-you-waste scheme.
Yeah.
And do you think that culture impacts the legality of these incentives? And that kind of relates back to that last question around what's the impetus in different departments, and the kind of how much values play a role, or ideology can play a role of different governments, etc.
Yeah, I mean, great question. I'm sure it does, and the fact that they're unlawful in the UK tells us something very cultural about it. I've never really thought about the question why. It might be, I mean, I'm not necessarily sure this would be the case, but it's almost a bit more collective rather than individualistic to make waste a flat fee. Everyone pays the same. I suspect that's not the reason for it. I suspect it's political and that people get very irate about their bins and how many bins they're allowed and what they can put in their bins. And, you know, I think it was probably quite telling that Rishi Sunak, one of the things that he wanted to do was make bins simpler. I suspect if it's not ideology, it's politics. But Jersey are about to go ahead with the pay-as-you-throw scheme. And it will be interesting, I think, maybe for me to go and have a little look at what the debates were like there and why that was tolerated in a way that it seems potentially politically impossible here. There is also, I'm trying to find the page in the post brief, but you could probably search the PDF and just search PAYT, but there was a little bit of evidence that there was a social norm element to why the pay-as-you-throw was effective. It wasn't just the financial mechanism. So there's always a challenge as a legal activist, we call it legal transplant, but you can't assume that something in one jurisdiction will just go and work in another, and the cultural aspects will be really important. I didn't write down the name of the person who asked that question, but yeah, really important question. And I should say, if people have questions that haven't been answered, you're very welcome to email me. If you Google Carrie Bradshaw Leeds, you're likely to get me than if you Google Carrie Bradshaw. Good luck finding my email address if you do that.
Well, thank you so much again, Carrie. We've run a couple of minutes over, but I was trying to get as many questions in as I could. We've had so many, and it's been such a varied and wide-ranging discussion, and I'm really grateful to you for fielding all those questions so ably and for a brilliant talk. And thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's attended, and we'll see you next month for Food Thinkers, for our next Food Thinkers. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.